Good evening. This is episode 12 of our podcast, Leitstern. We're talking about Venezuela today. And I will first tell you a bit about Venezuela in a piece that I wrote, and it's called The Good Neighbor. In 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced that the United States would henceforth behave like a good neighbor in its dealings with Latin American nations. This was quite understandable since FDR had decided to unleash a world war and needed to have a free hand to realize that project. Mexico, Central America and the Caribbean all benefited from the decision made in Washington and for a few years could breathe a bit more freely. South America was still largely dominated by investments and policy decisions from London. In response, all independent republics followed U.S. directives and after the U.S. entry into World War II declared war on Germany and Japan. Because England needed it to remain neutral, only Argentina refused to follow U.S. instructions until the war was almost over. On the whole, however, the respite was quite welcome all over Latin America. For 2 decades, there were no direct U.S. interventions in the area. In 1954, the U.S. judged it necessary to put an end to a government in Guatemala that had embarked on a program of far-reaching socio-economic and political reforms. These jeopardized the extensive interests in Guatemala by the United Fruit Company, bananas, and therefore a regime change operation was called for. After thus overthrowing the reformist regime of Jacobo Arbenz, the U.S. notably honored Cuba, 1960, the Dominican Republic, 65, Brazil, 64, and Argentina, 66, 76, Chile, 73, Panama, 89, and Haiti, 94, with regime change operations, recently adding Venezuela, 2026, to the list. Of these, only La Playa Girón, or Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, was a dismal failure. This was also the first ever direct U.S. intervention in Venezuela. For more than a century since in 1908 Juan Vicente Gómez was put in the saddle thanks to Dutch armed intervention, Venezuela was allowed to run its own affairs without direct foreign interference. In 1899, Cipriano Castro was elected president, but since he refused to accept the dictates of foreign businessmen operating in Venezuela, he was in perennial conflict with those foreign capitalists. These were primarily engaged in the production and export of coffee and cocoa. In 1903, England, Germany and Italy dispatched warships for a blockade of Venezuela's harbors. Briefly, Castro backed down, but still persisted in his policies regarding foreign capitalists. Then in 1908, the Netherlands, to which Venezuela's main foreign trading partner Curaçao belonged, sent warships to blockade Venezuela, upon which Castro left the country, leaving control in the hands of Vice President Gómez, who then decided to cooperate with the foreigners. Gómez, running the country himself, either as president or through others whom he used as a stand-in, presided over a fundamental transformation of the country. In 1914, after massive oil reserves were discovered in and around Lake Maracaibo, Venezuela began to produce increasing quantities of oil. In 1930, it had already become the world's second biggest producer, with almost 60 million tons after the United States. It is important to note that most of that oil came from wells controlled by Standard Oil's arch rival Shell, then directed by the Napoleon of oil, Sir Henry Dieterding. In those years, Venezuela had a population of only about 3 million in 1930. Since most of Venezuela's oil was being produced by Shell, which was about half English and had strong ties to the Rothschild Bank, Venezuela was off limits for the United States government, certainly until the 1940s. After Gómez left the stage in 1935, for a time, Venezuela reverted to traditional 19th century style politics, ending in 1950 with a traditional military coup led by a small group of colonels. One of these, Marcos Pérez Jiménez, became president in 1952, remaining in power until his ouster by another coup in 1958. Since the leaders of the coup ordered a return to democracy, elections for a new president were held. The winner of these elections was Rómulo Betancourt, leader and founder of the Social Democratic AD party. During the next 4 decades, Venezuela had a two-party political system. The other party was the Christian Democratic COPEI. The two-party system functioned quite satisfactorily, essentially because of Venezuela's generous oil income. It is said that from 1945 to the 1980s, Venezuela earned more money than the aggregate amount of Marshall aid, quote unquote, handed out by the United States to European nations, and that Marshall money was subject to stringent and limiting conditions. Most Venezuelan oil was exported to nearby Curaçao, where Shell operated a big refinery since 1918. In 1924, Standard Oil opened a refinery on the neighboring island of Aruba. In 1960, Venezuela was the world's second biggest oil producer, with about 15% of total production. Since the population was only a little over 7 million then, Venezuela actually was a very rich country. By 1990, however, Venezuela had sunk to seventh position among the world's crude oil producers, while the population had tripled to about 20 million. In other words, in a relative sense, oil income was shrinking. However, since the domestic market was too small to seriously consider industrialization and income still relatively high in comparison with other Latin American countries, the stability of the political system became affected. As a matter of fact, it was built on massive corruption and graft. Some sort of change was therefore becoming increasingly inevitable. Change came in the 1990s, in the person of Hugo Chavez, a popular army officer. In 1992, wishing to realize a great number of urgently needed reforms in the country, Chavez staged a coup against President Carlos Andrés Pérez, popularly known as CAP. This womanizing veteran leader of the AD party was widely known for being corrupt to the core. During his first presidency, from 1974 to 79, he stole millions out of the national oil income and invested these in building projects in Miami. He was elected for a second term in 89 because voters believed he had already stuffed his pockets sufficiently to refrain from another round of stealing. Yet from the outset of his second presidency, Cap began to steal on an even larger scale, this time seriously. Small wonder that Chavez enjoyed massive popularity. Although he was arrested, tried and thrown in jail for his coup attempt, he got out in 1994 and solidified his position as a leading figure in national politics outside the two-party system. In 1999, Chavez was elected president and stayed in power until 2013, when he died from a mysterious disease. The new leader was Nicolás Maduro, a political ally of Chavez, who continued the policies of his predecessor to the dismay of the Americans. Since Chavez sought to free his country from the clutches of the good neighbor, he soon became a target of American anger and indignation. What the Americans above all failed to understand was that Venezuelans were seeking a way to become a truly independent nation in their own right, fully in line with the dreams and prospects of national liberator Simón Bolívar. After some 2 centuries of efforts, it seemed the time had finally come to realize the old dream. However, no matter how you try to change your living arrangements, there is one thing you cannot change, and that is to choose your neighbor. With a neighbor like the United States, it is by definition impossible for a nation to be truly independent, especially if it has natural resources such as oil. Today, apart from direct neighbors such as Mexico and Cuba, the US also has indirect neighbors like Venezuela, where it wants to impose its controls. Just like the Mexicans and the Cubans, the Venezuelans have no option but to conclude that they are far from God and close to the United States.
Welcome, audience, to this 12th episode of Leitstern, presented to you by our Dutch dissident triumvirate, Sietse Bosman, joining us from Frisia, Hans Vogel, who has just presented his case on Venezuela tonight, joining us from Italy, and myself, Alexander Wolfgezen, your host, joining us temporarily also from the Low Countries. This will be for our first episode for the new year, 2026. We, of course, send you all the best wishes, and we hope you'll be joining us for regular podcast, which we are scheduled to do twice monthly here on this channel. That all being said, you just have heard the introduction about the topic of today, which is, of course, the state of affairs currently in Venezuela, a country that is less remote from Holland than people suspect, because Holland is still the owner of a number of islands, some of them located off the shores of Venezuela. Holland also has a history that it shares with Venezuela, with its better and its darker sides. And this history is not totally irrelevant to the topic today. The topic today, of course, is the geopolitical predicament of the country. It finds itself now in after, well, we can say the kidnapping of its legal leader, its president, who has been, of course, abducted to the United States. And the country, of course, is also subject to all kinds of other boycott and blockade instruments of our Anglo-Saxon overlords, who are ruling not only most of Latin America directly or indirectly, but also Europe, of course. And these forces have decided that they are going to implement a very old instrument, namely the instrument of gunboat diplomacy. Under this episode, we'll be pinning a link to an article written also by Hans Vogel on this topic, gunboat diplomacy, published just a few months ago on Ans Review. Since that time, of course, things have changed, but that does not mean that the problem has gone away or that the problem has altered in any way. Geopolitics is linked, unfortunately, to geography, something that is very difficult to alter and that stays with the politicians of all days in recorded history. So the geopolitics that I'm here referring to as far as the Dutch, I think I would like to remind the audience of that at least before I give the floor to my esteemed fellow panel members. So the Dutch history there, of course, it's going back to the times that the Dutch started to colonize parts of what already was then Latin America. The Dutch were interlopers, pirates, were plucking away certain small and less small parts of the empires of the Portuguese and the Spanish empires. And in that time, more specifically the 17th century, they decided to also try to catch a piece of the rich pickings of Venezuela, which of course was very strategic in many senses. The Orinoco Delta was one of the places that the Dutch tried to control. And this might seem ancient history, but is not, because the borders that were drawn in that time, that were claimed by the Dutch in that time, are still giving problems till today. So those borders were, of course, also confirmed by the British Empire, which later on took the western part of the Guianas, which border Venezuela to the east. And the border there is in dispute since that time. So the western Guyana border could be drawn in the middle of what is now called Guyana, but it can also be drawn much further to the west, where it is located now. And Venezuela doesn't agree, it never has agreed on this border. And this dispute, of course, is also something that has been exploited many times all over by the United States in its disputes either with Venezuela itself or with its great power competitors, Britain in this case. So in the beginning of the 20th century, America and Britain were already fighting about this border. Now, at this moment, this border dispute might not be the most urgent one, but there are other elements to the Dutch history that are important to note as well, and that is the precedent set by the Dutch in terms of gunboat diplomacy. So gunboat diplomacy already was exercised a number of times on Venezuela since the early 20th century, more frequently than in many other places, because the country is such an oil-rich place. So, of course, the intervention that springs to mind is that one of 1908 for the Dutch, because the Dutch, in fact, tried to blackmail and partially succeeded in blackmailing Venezuela over a number of disputes. I will not go into the historical background, but it clearly is the case that Holland has, as the Dutch say in a saying, butter on its head when it speaks about the current American intervention in Venezuela in anything but the most laudatory terms. So the Dutch would do good to be a little bit humble in this sense and take a back seat when commenting on the imperialistic policies of the Americans. Of course, other European great powers have also intervened regularly in Latin America. 1903 comes to mind when European flotilla went to Venezuela to blackmail the country into all kinds of concessions. Of course, all of this revolves around the question of oil, the question of the kind of oil that Venezuela produces, of course, we can say that it is perhaps not the most urgent kind of oil that is being sold on the world market, but still it's a quite impressive source of oil income and other revenue incomes, including gold, diamonds, and other places. And here we come to another part of the introduction that it is my job here to give you, and that is an introduction about the geography of the country. Let's just recall how impressive that country is. So we are talking about a country here 4 times the size of the UK. So people in Europe tend to forget the scale of things overseas. This is a huge place. It's 32 million people inhabiting it. Jungles, mountains ranging to 5,000 meters, including mountains that used to have to very frequent recently eternal snow on top of them. People Bolivar, which of course Mount Bolivar, and this geography is impressive in all sense of the word. The country is not only rich, it's also very beautiful. Not only its women are, also its nature is. And the country is impressive in all kinds of respects, historically as well. And we might here come to notice the name of the country in its official version, which is the Bolivarian Republic. So to remind our audience, this is not irrelevant. The fact that this country claims this title, like Iran claims the title Islamic Republic, Venezuela claims the title Bolivarian Republic, is not irrelevant. It is Venezuela sees itself as the heir to the freedom struggle of the Latin American nations as a collective, which were led primarily by people, that were from the southern part of America. So what is used to be called Greater Colombia, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and some other regions. And Venezuela is also, in other senses, adhere to that original conception of liberation. It's still a federal republic, even although it's quite centralized. And that, of course, pays tribute to the fact that the Americans, South and Central Americans, Latin Americans, tried to confederate originally when they fought for freedom. And the way they wanted to do that is to create a confederacy from all Spanish-speaking people, at least, all the way from what is now Arizona and New Zealand, all the way to Patagonia. That didn't work out, but the fact that the federal system is still in place, it shows the inception of the Bolivarian Republic. It shows its ideas. It shows its attitude towards history. In another sense, Venezuela is also located in the center of the revolt that used to be fought against the Spanish in the early 19th century. And that is also an heritage that stays with the nation. So it's quite, as our colleague Hans Vogel has pointed out earlier, a quite militant nation in many senses. And of course, it's paying tribute to that heritage right now, standing up against the United States still, even although its president has been boycotted, even although it has been blockaded, and even although it seems to be cut off and under pressure in all the sense of the word. That all being said as an introduction, I will switch to my colleague from Frischer, Sietse Bosman, and to him the question, would you like to comment on the introduction of Hans Vogel? Do you have something to add to it, Sietse?
Hmm. There may be a problem, I think, in connection. Do you want me to elaborate on that? What you said before?
Sietse, are you with us again?
Yes. It seemed to have a very bad connection.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, I was
Did,
just inviting your comments on Hans' article, his introduction, and your thoughts about it.
um, yes. Well, what is striking is that, as Hans already said in a sarcastic tone, the good neighbor. Let us not forget that the United States has been at war roughly 90% of the time of its existence. So yeah, that doesn't really bode well, of course, for the countries surrounding it. What I also would like to add is that all kinds of accusations of imperialism are flying around, but there isn't really a Western country that doesn't have its origins in conquest and in force. So nobody can really point any fingers at any, excuse me, at anybody else. And well, the biggest players are going to exert the most influence, and yeah, I think that's kind of inevitable. But what what is always the case is that, and I think that Hans hints at this in his article, is that when these regimes are removed, it is not necessarily, of course, military power that the United States wants in these countries. It is the so that they can inject their federal banking system and loot the societies for all that they're worth. And so can we really speak of the U.S. doing these things, or are we talking about, global financial institutions that simply operate under the flag of the United States? There are, of course, some things I think that are very striking. Oh yeah, the first thing I want to is that this was the first action by the United States in which they physically went in to take a government leader. But I thought that Noriega of Panama was actually the first. Um, but anyway, I forgot what I was trying to say with all this uh, stuff with my connection. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Well, of course, what you're saying is that power is absolute, and absolute power corrupts, and the rule of international law, as we know it, international rules, they are just a compromise. They are just agreements between great powers, and they are not the standard setting of realpolitik, as they say it in German, so real politics. And of course, there is another thing that I think needs to be mentioned in this respect, and that is the special status of the United States in international law. It's not just that the United States claims a manifest destiny for itself and that it has an administration instead of a government. It's also that its historical position has been um, a nation above law or setting the law. It has conceived itself as such in opposition to European tradition, and it has functioned as such in terms of economic and geopolitical expression. This was already noted by the great German legal philosopher of international law, Carl Schmitt, who said that the nomos, so the law as it was set out in international relations and conceived in Europe as part of the greater Christian commonwealth of nations, was never adhered to by the United States, and that the United States relates to international law as a negative. Um, of course, people can look at his analysis more in depth. Suffice to say that this means that the United States, from its conception onwards, has had a very specific and very special, unique position in the international system. I think what we are seeing right now is nothing but a expression of the same. We are seeing the United States, in fact, living up to its original position, its original claims, its original um, uh, power structure. And I think that what Sietse mentioned is that the interests that rule the United States, which are not classical um, ground based land rooted interests, that these interests they define themselves above international politics and above the interest of the United States. They actually, in fact, probably have always done so, but it becomes more obvious in the current setting. And I think that Venezuela is a very good case in point, because of course there has been this attempt by all kinds of countries, naive or otherwise, to establish a multipolar order. This project is now been making since maybe a decade or so, maybe a little longer. And I think what the leader of the United States, whether we like him or not, has done is actually do us all a favor, namely remind us of the reality, remind us of the reality prevailing of United States being a classical hegemon, so more in the sense of the Athenian Delian League rather than any great power in the 19th century term, an absolute ruler, but not being concerned with um, local laws or international rules other than those suitable to its commercial and ideological interests. So I think this is a very useful time, in fact, for people to look at international politics. If there's any time since the early 20th century to look at international politics and discover something new, it would be probably this time, the time that the system is changing. That all being said, Hans Vogel, you have heard something about the introduction that I have given and something about Carl Schmitt. You have heard also Sietz's comments. Is there something you would like to add to the introduction you gave?
Well, yes, I might add a few things that maybe are unknown to the English-speaking public, even to the Dutch. Basically, that the Dutch and Venezuela have a very long-standing, friendly relationship, and the Dutch naval intervention in 1908, which brought to power basically Juan Vicente Gomez, the man who laid the foundations for the modern for present-day Venezuela, that he was brought to power by the Dutch Navy basically in 1908. And since then, but even before, there have been very close personal relations between the Dutch and the Venezuelans through the islands of Curacao and Aruba. The elites in Aruba and Curacao were intermarrying with the Venezuelan elites. And the name Maduro, the guy who was kidnapped by the United States, Nicolas Maduro, is also the name of a prominent Curacao family. And one of them it was killed by the Germans in the Second World War. It was in the resistance, and that's Maduro, George Maduro. And I know other families that have family members have been killed by the Germans. Ecudi, for example, who was a national hero in Aruba, and Boy Ecudi, so there are very close and long-standing relationships between the local elites in the Dutch-controlled islands in the Caribbean and Venezuela. And this gives the entire relationship between the Netherlands and Venezuela a very strong foundation, which it doesn't have with the Dutch don't have with say Santo Domingo or Puerto Rico or Colombia, etc., Argentina, especially with Venezuela. And even to the point that when I was doing archival research back in the 80s and 90s in the state archives in The Hague, the Algemeen Rijksarchief, the National Archives, there was a special room visible for everybody in the archives at the ground floor, where a member of the Venezuelan secret police, secret service, because I know him personally, was there doing research on the Dutch-Venezuelan frontier. He was looking into piles of documents, setting sort of describing the border, the sea limit, the sea border between the Dutch Antilles and Venezuela and the continental shelf of Venezuela, doing research to fundament further claims of I think oil deposits. So so there, this sort of thing. And why did this guy? He'd been living in the Netherlands for a long time. He was for years and years. He was working in the archives, and everybody knew him, and he was friendly and drank coffee with everybody because there was. And he spoke Dutch fluently, and of course Papiamento, and of course Spanish and English and all the other languages. He was a member of the Venezuelan elite, member of the Secret Service, and also an archival researcher for for the Venezuelan government. So that sort of thing you could find if you had an open eye for it, you could find it in the Netherlands. And the same goes for Curacao and Aruba. And what I also want to underline is that most people have a sort of tend to look sort of down on Latin America. And we have been talking about this earlier with the Colombian philosopher. And I've been teaching in Venezuela for a couple of times in the UCB, Universidad Central de Venezuela, which is a flagship university, which has a wonderful campus, really wonderful. And they have a wonderful library also. And very close to the university is the Teatro Teresa Carreño, which is one of the biggest theaters in Latin America, where first-rate, first-class musicians in European classical music, Venezuelan music, also the music sort of perform, and where they have a bookstore, the likes of which I've never seen anywhere in Europe. A big bookstore where they had everything imaginable. I mean, incredible. And also the fact that one of the nicest, most beautiful libraries in Latin America at all, and on Latin America, is in Venezuela, which was one of the henchmen of Juan Vicente Gomez. And he was also stuffing his pockets immensely. But with the money, he bought books all over the place. And he donated these books to the National Library. And they have about 250,000 volumes of rare volumes that you don't find anywhere else, but in Venezuela. And he has been sort of, Venezuela is also a treasure trove of sort of important cultural sort of assets that you do not find even in Spain or certainly not in other Latin American countries. So the standards are and sometimes are very high, and so you find many differences between sort of the extremes that you don't find in Europe, say 20 years ago. Now, because of Europe's going down the drain, you find it more and more. But you see, Venezuela is a country which has these sort of special enchantments and also these unexpected treasures to be discovered by anybody with an open eye for and with a knowledge of Spanish. That's what I want to add about Venezuela. So I really have a very strong liking for Venezuela and for Venezuelans because they're very nice people, very humorous, very funny, and very intelligent. So
I think this is a very good contribution you made because this gives an extra insight not only to the Dutch-Venezuelan relations, but also to what is Venezuela. I think the name, of course, of the country is not chosen for nothing. It was chosen Little Venice, which is quite a compliment, saying something about how it has been perceived and how it has perceived itself throughout the ages. I would like to add a small detail here. So, of course, Maduro, the famous Dutch Antillean family that Hans Vogel here referred to. If people visit the city that I lived a long time in Holland, Den Haag, The Hague, the government seat, there is a site that all tourists go to. It's called Madurodam. It is a mini city, namely a replica of many things Dutch, but on a mini scale where children can amuse themselves, but adults do as well, and where people go to make selfies. It is probably the largest miniature city in the world. And it's called Madurodam for a reason, because Maduro actually, his family died in the war. And he was executed by the German occupants. And his family made many contributions to cultural life in Den Haag especially, but of course Holland in general. That's why he is remembered that way. Another thing that points to the symbiosis that Hans Vogel here has referred to between the Dutch and Venezuela, which is not irrelevant now in the current crisis, is the very simple fact that 3 strategic islands, Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire, are lying quite close offshore of Venezuela. These islands have not been used as a military base by the Americans, who are forced to spend millions and billions of dollars maintaining these ships at sea without being able to use the small and convenient air and port facilities of these islands, despite the fact that there are plenty of precedents for such uses. Because when the Second World War happened, of course, these islands were used by the Allies, the Anglos, the Americans, and the British as bases and as garrison holding stations. So that has not happened now. And I think this neutrality stands from the Dutch point of view, which is very discreet in many ways, is not for nothing. There is a reason for that. I think the Dutch, they like to hedge their bets in this region, even although it was even just because of economic reasons. Many people, they get a bad education these days, so just let's remind them that the oil that comes from Venezuela was till recently refined for a large part in the Dutch Antils, Aruba and Curacao, which is also the reason that in the Second World War these islands were occupied by the Americans and the British. So these refineries were, let's say, strategic assets. They're still there, but much less important. There were strategic assets of such importance that even the Germans sent an entire squadron of U-boats to attack them. Battles that took place there, they have been a little bit forgotten in history, but they took place, and the Germans recognized the importance of this region. The same that other interlopers right now, the Russians and the Chinese, recognize the importance of Venezuela. It's well known that the Russians and the Chinese have sent ships, civilian or military, into the region, have sent military advisors into the region, have probably armed the Venezuelan military. And such intervention is understandable from a geopolitical point of view, because hitting Venezuela or even just disturbing the workings of the oil industry and the links to the Dutch Antils even slightly would have great repercussions. Like the Germans not only sent U-boats to the Dutch Antils, they even sailed into the very shallow and narrow bay of Maracaibo. So they tried to do damage there. So even a slight damage might give a great profit, an out of proportion profit. And I think this we are seeing repeated. I do think that the importance of Venezuela to its the current interlopers, Russia and China, has been stated wrongly by many commenters. They don't understand the true position of these countries, because there has been a lot of ado about the Russians planting missiles there or creating a second Cuba or something like that. But it's in fact the Chinese that are now having the most interest in this region. So they have invested a lot in infrastructure. They have important oil connections to Venezuela. And it's not a coincidence that at the beginning of this year, this supply route of oil to China from there has come under attack at the same time that the other second large oil route is coming under attack now, namely the Persian oil route. The Chinese, they import 40% of their oil either from Venezuela or from Iran. So it's not a coincidence these things are taking place at the same time. There's definitely a link. And people, they have not taken notice in Europe of the very discreet but very sharp response of the Chinese to what has happened in Venezuela. So they have in fact forbidden their ships, which is 40% of the total tonnage of all commercial ships in the world, to go directly to ports in America. So imports can take place, but they will have to go through other ports, which of course cost lots of money and force import duties. That not only that, they have put strategic sanctions on technological cooperation, and all kinds of other measures have been implemented. People can look at that. They are commercial measures, but I think if the empire is sensitive to any kind of measures, it's not military measures, it's the commercial measures. So I think this is something that has been overlooked and I wanted to add. But I'll give the floor to my colleague from Frisha. Sietse, do you have something to add?
Excuse me. Well, there are many people who are talking about international law and its so-called transgressions. As we mentioned earlier, um, we are being exposed to the fact that sort of Redbeard's idea that might is right is really the way that things fly in the world, because international law makes you have yeah, it gives the impression that there is a status quo. You can only have international law if things stay the same and if national borders stay the same. But throughout history, especially in Europe, borders have always shifted, and borders of Russia have changed many times. The borders of China have changed many times, and the United States is, of course, a little over 200 years old. So the idea that its boundaries would never shift, and they have, even if in its short existence, of course, they conquered Mexico and so we are looking at the fact that things are changing, and that the imperialism is not dead. That America seeks influence in its sphere of influence. So it tries to, get Greenland to join it, and will is working actively to get China and Russia out of South America. And I think geopolitically that is a smart thing to do, just as Russia is, of course, exerting its influence in its own sphere of influence. And China is, I think, losing a lot of influence. So, um, geopolitically, I think that people are still under the impression that China is some sort of giant that would equal Russia or America with it, but it's not simply not the case. And what Alexander already said is that the economic factors that are at play here are extremely significant. I believe that China is owner of half of more of America's national debt. But vice versa, America owns a very large swath of Chinese national debt. So that has, of course, grave implications for the relations that you have. And one of the things that happened with the European Union and Ukraine situation is that the European Union thought it would be wise to take the money that was frozen from Russian assets and deploy this as money and grants to Ukraine to buy weapons. But this is a transgression of this so-called national law. If you even if you're at war with each other, but if you start messing with each other's assets, then you set the door wide open to a very different uh, system of tension in the world, because Russia immediately seized an enormous amount of European assets that were in Russia. So it was a completely stupid move, and I think that I think perhaps we are moving towards a paradigm in which these countries are going to say, well, you own a lot of my national debt, but I'm simply not going to pay it back. I'm going to default on my loan. And this is going to have significant economic um, consequences. Now, I'm certainly not a financial expert, but I have listened enough to people who think that this is happening, and that so not only are we going to see a political shift, but a very very significant economical shift.
Well, of course, this topic also brings us to this current larger picture of the Western Hemisphere. So, Sietse here mentioned um, Greenland, the affairs of Greenland. And what has happened to Venezuela is, of course, just an expression of policy shift towards open, more classical form of imperialism, which of course includes the prospect of different areas being added to the American empire in a direct sense, in a formal sense. Let's say that this is not without precedent. In 1917, the Americans they bought another Danish possession, namely the Danish West Indies, which was one of the sugar isles in Thomas and others. They were bought, yeah, the Virgin Islands. They were bought by the Americans in the First World War because they were afraid that these bases would uh, become used by the Germans as U-boat bases or anything else. But of course, that was just a cover. The real intent was to just exclude as much as possible the Western Hemisphere for American interest, to make it an exclusive zone, to pull into the orbit as much territory as possible. The Second World War saw a repetition of that. So the Lend-Lease Agreement, under which the Americans based themselves in all kinds of British possessions, including the Bermudas. And of course, Greenland was under occupation. So Denmark was under German occupation, Denmark itself. But during the First World War, Second World War, Greenland was under American occupation, and that occupation lasted. It's still under American occupation. People, they forget that. So one of the largest bases, strategic bases of the Americans, it's still there. So I think we are seeing some tendencies that were always there, just shifting into new forms, taking on a new, more open form, perhaps a more formalized form, which might also be a response of the Americans to the weakness of Europe. Perhaps to take out the European powers from the Western Hemisphere is just a self-protection measurement. Yeah, they don't want instability on their doorstep. They don't want weakness. They want not only direct grasp materials, they also want to make their own neighborhood safe, which is also what they are doing in Venezuela. So from this point of view, realpolitik speaking, it's a smart move. It's an understandable move. It's a legitimate move. Legitimate in the sense that it conforms to classical geopolitical decision-making patterns. And I think from this point of view, we can argue that the United States is nothing but setting its print on the Western Hemisphere, saying this is our backyard and just get out of here. The question, of course, is to what extent are other countries allowed to have the backyard? Because, as I said earlier, the Americans have a very peculiar idea about geopolitics in general and about America's position in the world, which is, they believe, special. They are allowed to do things that others are not allowed, which is, of course, not strange for an hegemon. But this is something that we perhaps also might now look at. Because the question is, to what extent is the United States even able to implement this, let's say, this new Trumpo-Monroe doctrine? Is it able to do so, Hans Vogel? You are our Western Hemisphere specialist here. If you look at history and if you look at the current situation, what do you think is the larger trajectory? What is the overall development of the geopolitical balance of power in the Western Hemisphere? And to what extent can Trump do what he apparently wants to do, and that is make the Western Hemisphere American quarter?
Well, that's a good point. I think we have to understand basically that the Americans or the United States, and I don't want to be unkind to Americans in general, I don't want to be sound bitter or nasty, but America has nothing to offer. America, if you look at when Americans go abroad, when they do business, what have they do to business to do? What do they have to do business with? They have dollars, and they hope that you will take their dollars. But what can those dollars buy ultimately? They can buy you soft drinks, which are very bad for your health. They can buy you inferior food, like hamburgers and Kentucky Fried Chickens and sort of thing. They can buy you, they can enable you to see very bad movies, ideological movies that have a totally weird outlook on the world and on history and everything. They can buy you, so you can listen to horrible music that is not music. That's bad for your ears and bad for your. So everything America has to offer is bad, and The Chinese, when they come, they build railways. They bring these thousands of work, like in Tanzania in the 1960s and 70s. They built this narrow gauge railway for Tanzania, which still functions. The Chinese, they do concrete things, and they have interest in trade. And they basically, I don't know if they respect other people, I don't care, but they do business with them, and they do business on an equal basis. And Americans never do business on an equal basis. They want you, when you do business with them, to regard them as superior, as better, as the best thing since sliced bread. And it's impossible. Americans have a different attitude to the rest of the world. They think they're superior to anybody else in the world. The Chinese do not have this feeling and this attitude, which makes the Chinese more pleasant to do business with because they have more to offer. And I think these days Chinese cars are popping up everywhere. China has supplanted Germany as the major and the best car producer. Maybe Toyota still makes a few good cars. But what the Chinese make is like, it's the same what happened in Japan in the 1940s, 50s. Japanese manufacturers were bad, sort of were lower quality. But then after the war, Japanese made in Japan stood for quality. Cameras, sort of tools, anything, sort of machinery, everything from Japan was suddenly very good after the Second World War. Like Germany, it was the Germany of Asia after the Second World War. Whereas before that, it was just cheap imitations. And the same has happened to China. What was Chinese used to be inferior quality until a few decades ago. Now it's very good. I mean, cell phones from China are very good. The same as cell phones from Apple. I think they're made in China too. So the Chinese, when they make things, they make them of high quality. When they do business with you, they do business with real stuff. You can buy real silk, you can buy real railways, you can buy anything real. They have industry. America has no industry. No longer nothing. They produce nothing. So what they want to offer in Latin America, I wonder what it is. They have nothing to offer. And as a matter of fact, the Latin Americans themselves are coming to the United States in quantities because life is cheaper and more, so far, cheaper. And it has probably better labor opportunities than in Latin American countries, many of them, especially in Central America and the Caribbean, and also in Venezuela. Because of the American sanctions against Venezuela. So America is maybe attractive for Latin Americans to go there and to work there, but they want to go back as soon as possible. They always retain relationship with their mother country, their home country. So I don't think the United States being alone, they have nothing to offer. And the Latin Americans are not crazy, they're not idiots, and they realize that what the United States has to offer them is nothing, nothing that they cannot have access to already. So they can have bad soft drinks, they can have bad hamburgers, but they don't. They prefer their own fast food. So this is what I see. And China is leading the world in technology. And last year, I think China was for the first time, China had more patent applications than anybody else in the world. So they were leading the world in patent applications, which is also a sort of a sign for technological prowess and progress. So the Chinese are on top of things, and anything that any negative comment about the Chinese in the West, I think has to be regarded with suspicion. So I believe China. Yes.
I think here we're coming to the topic of agency. Of course, agency being a sociological, cultural, anthropological term, but also being applicable in the political realm. So generally, Latin America is looked at from a Western perspective as a potential colony or a passive subject to other interests. But of course, there is a question of agency there. So that Latin America is divided into many countries, some smaller, and subject to a new colonial exploitative regime that is well known. But that does not mean it doesn't have agency. It had agency at several points in a very dramatic fashion even. We all like to remind that the only successful invasion of United States took place from Mexico by Pancho Villa in 1916. So, of course, that was something that was attributed to the Germans, but was not. It was a punitive expedition by a leader of the Mexican Revolution. Of course, it had disastrous consequences, but nonetheless, the point was made. And the question of agency here in geopolitics, we might expand perhaps a little on. And that is to ask the question, to what extent does Europe have agency? Or more precisely, Europe not existing, European Union being in its death throes probably. What agency do European powers have, European countries have probably, because powers is a little bit outdated term, I think, if we talk about the European states now. And this brings us to our own predicament as Europeans, as European nations, having suffered occupation regime now for decades, which we might call, let's say, an Anglo or a globalist occupation regime. But this regime being shifting now gears, retrenching to a certain extent, perhaps to its own hemisphere, to the West, leaving Europe high and dry in certain senses, bankrupt certainly, perhaps being shorn of its overseas colonies such as Greenland. And this brings us to the predicament of Europe. To what extent does Europe have agency? Do European nations have agency? And what is the geopolitical fallout from this realignment that's taking place? Sietse, your thoughts on that? I think that's something we should address.
Well, the European Union, basically, so the administrative entity that is on top of the European countries, which must always be seen as two separate things. But basically, the European and the European countries of NATO have zero agency. They have no power. We have no war economy. We have for decades cut our spending on military equipment or military personnel. I myself have been a professional soldier in the Dutch military, and we literally had to run around the forest shouting "pang pang" because we didn't even have blanks for our rifles. We sold our tanks. Yeah, we have no meaningful equipment. We bought a handful of way too complicated jet fighters that are way too expensive. And if you look at countries like Russia, who still cling to the axiom that we needed reliable and simple and stupid, and they can churn out jet fighters and tanks in enormous quantities because they didn't go for high tech. It is always more efficient to pump out 1,000 tanks than your enemy who pumps out 200 very high tech units. This has proven time and time again in the Second World War, for instance, where the Germans came out with the very high tech Panzer and Tiger tanks, but they simply couldn't build them fast enough to keep up with Russian T-90 tanks. And this is exactly the same in today. We have virtually zero ammunition stocks. We do not have heavy bombs in plenty. We simply do not have these things. Mind you, that even though the Netherlands and most of the European countries, or at least the Netherlands and some European countries, have bought this. I forget this. Is it the F-35? I forgot the name of this fancy new fighter. They have a few of these things, but mostly our Air Force of the Netherlands consists of F-16 fighters, which are now close to 40 years old. And this is true for much of the European armies. The French still have the Mirage airplanes. The Germans still have the Tornadoes, and these are all old equipment. And it wouldn't stand a chance against a Russia or America or China, let alone in terms of people. We have made the switch to professional armies because, well, in all honesty, conscription armies are really useless armies because you get substandard people for your military. And but they are very, very small. I think the Netherlands has around 50 to 60,000 military personnel, of which only a fraction are actual fighting units. And this is true for all the countries in Europe. I believe Poland is the largest army, but it is also not a very advanced army, and the military is still equipped with basically 1970s AK-47 rifles. They probably made some modernization, but special forces always do. They always get the very fancy equipment, but the run of the mill infantry units usually end up with very ancient stuff. Um, I was in the military in 2004, roughly, and in 2004 we were running around in IPR vehicles, which are equivalent to the Bradley fighting vehicles of the Americans, which were from the 1970s. Anyone who had an ordinary rifle with um, armor-piercing ammunition could take out these vehicles. They were utterly useless. And this is the story of Europe. We are basically we're irrelevant militarily. So no agency.
Well, I think, of course, Holland has always been very well prepared for the last war. It always has been. Which, of course, in our case, in Holland, means that we are very well prepared to fight a war like in Yugoslavia. This means bombing innocent civilians from a very far height and in a very safe position, or killing some local tribesmen in the Afghan mountains, provided we are protected sufficiently by the American Air Force, and perhaps put a few people on the ground here and there for so-called peacekeeping missions, which basically boil down to um, holidays paid by the government. So I think, yes, Holland has a boutique army. That's clear. It's a boutique army, not more than that. And I think it has been created on purpose. I think it's not just money saving that the Dutch always have done on their military, always being rather scrounchy and rather reluctant to invest in warlike material as long as it is not absolutely necessary, and even then fighting it hand and teeth. So that is another problem that Holland has anyway. But I think here we are talking about, let's say, the political equivalent of a learned helplessness, right? Holland has been, together with the rest of Europe, under globalist occupation now intensively for a couple of decades, has been taught to be helpless, to rely on other forces to make its decisions, other forces to fight its wars. And I think we are paying the bill for that now. But of course, that does not mean that a comeback is not possible at the moment that sovereignty is restored. I would even turn it around. I think the fact that sovereignty is lacking is also responsible for the fact that the European nations have no agency. Agency is defined by sovereignty. There is no agency without sovereignty. And I think if one proof of the lack of sovereignty is obvious, it is the helplessness of Europe right now in this shifting geopolitical landscape. So it's not only Denmark that's unable to defend effectively Greenland from an American invasion. The Dutch would also be unable to stop Trump from sending troops to the Dutch possessions in the Caribbean Sea. It wouldn't. They wouldn't last even the 5 days that the Dutch army lasted against the German army in 1940. I think this we should look at from a bigger perspective. This learned helplessness, this lack of agency, this lack of sovereignty is a direct consequence of intentional globalist policies, as I see it. Of course, here we are good conspiracy theorists, so this is a normal way for us to look at things, but for many people it's not. For many people, this is quite shocking. And I think to look at Venezuela from the largest perspective is probably even more interesting than looking just from the geopolitical interest, because there is a larger perspective. The larger perspective is the globalist ideological perspective, because there are definitely geopolitical factors at work here that cannot be only explained by power politics alone. For example, the timing of the Venezuela operation and the new color revolution attempt in Iran, both aimed at vital oil resource places hurting China, but of course also being conducive to the interests of a small nation in the Middle East, which nation, of course, is, let's say, the crown jewel of the globalist um, ideal world. The crown jewel in this sense, I think that probably the end game of this globalist elite would be something like establishing an Pax Judaica across the whole world. This means peace that is defined by Judaic practices, and I'm talking here about banking practices, of course, foremost. The unrestrained imposition of usury. We should not forget that Venezuela was a nation that refused to participate in the classical banking practices. One of the reasons that it was sanctioned as it was, and it is subject to such interference, is its refusal to participate in normal day-to-day global finance constructions, as was the case with Libya, as is the case still with Iran. So I think there is a larger project at work here, a larger project that explains the geopolitical movements that we are seeing. And I think from that perspective, that largest, let's say, globalist ideological perspective, many things become more clear. And I think it's a high stake phase of the game that we have entered. I think that what we are seeing, the fact that Trump is taking off the mask, the glove of soft power, putting on the iron fist of hard power, is probably primarily explained by the fact that the globalist ideological program is facing its final test, is going into its final phase. It has to subdue its adversaries that are rebelling against the greater globalist order, against this possible Pax Judaica. And I'm talking here about primarily about the economic power that it represents, although there is an ideological component also, of course. Of course, this is a very large perspective, and we are not aware directly of the ideas and the plans of the real power elite. This means the people that are behind Trump, that are steering the greater powers that are steering world politics. We are not privy to their consultations, but we can deduce something from what is happening. And I think to conclude this episode, I would like to ask your opinion about this, Hans. You have studied Venezuela intensively. It's part of your specialty field. And if you look from this larger perspective, what do you think Venezuela means? At what stage of the globalist project are we? And what is in store for us this coming year on a larger geopolitical stage? What do you think?
It'll be very hard to make predictions for a year. It's if you make predictions over a longer period, they tend to be vaguer, and that's why they're often more truthful, or they can be proved more truthful in the end. So to make precise predictions for the current year we're in, I think I wouldn't do that. But I think that, well, I would be loath to do that, reluctant to do that. But the way I see it, look, Venezuelans are very independent-minded people, and it's difficult. They're very individualistic also, but they also are conscious of their collectivity, of being Venezuelans, and very proud to be Venezuelans. And the same goes for people in Colombia, and the same goes for people in Argentina. And although Argentinians, as friends of mine told me, they're more inclined to become a part of the American empire, especially under President Milei. But if you notice what has happened in Peru lately, where they have succeeded, the people have succeeded in deposing a president, a female president, or in Bolivia, Paraguay. These are all nations with a very conscious, self-reliant, proud population. proud of their national heritage, proud of their local language, whether it be a variety of Spanish or Guarani, like in Paraguay, or Quechua in Peru, or the tribal languages, the national languages of the different Indian peoples in Colombia and Ecuador. These people are very very difficult to get a grip on, I think. And if the globalists want to control Latin America and the places I just mentioned, like they have been controlling Europe effectively over the past decades, like they have been controlling other areas of the world, United States, Canada, etc., that's going to be a sort of difficult, surprising experience for them. I don't think it's going to be that easy, if only because the countries are not yet finished. There are still nations in the process of being forming themselves, of constituting a true nation, experienced by all the inhabitants of that sort of national area. So but they have more primitive nationalism that we used to have maybe in the 19th century. I don't know, because I haven't studied that field. But like maybe Germany in the 1930s, or maybe Italy in the 1920s and 30s. That's what I see in Latin America. Maybe also like to see it that way. But I think that Latin Americans are more independent-minded on a whole, more individualistic, less inclined to follow government directions. So take this injection, take this jab, do this, do that, listen to that, don't say this. So they're less easy to manipulate the way Europeans have been manipulated after the Second World War. And that's an advantage. So it's going to be very hard for the globalist elites to put their plans in operation in the northern part of Latin America and the Andean countries, and I don't know, but Argentina is a different case. Uruguay maybe also, but certainly not Brazil, certainly not Venezuela, certainly not Colombia, I think.
Well, of course, we have already last year done an episode about third worldism, which of course is always something that is a threat to the dissident right, to European dissidents, which is shortly to say the idealization of overseas resistance movements, the global axis of resistance, of which Venezuela is definitely a part. It tends to inspire certain elements of European dissenters. But we should be very careful here, because the models of what overseas countries have to offer us are not directly transferable to Europe. We have our own very specific set of circumstances to cope with in Europe. And I think perhaps it's wise to conclude this episode with asking Sietse Bosman to comment about that, because third worldism being a danger for dissident right, nevertheless, the example of an axis of resistance against a larger globalist enemy, this we can certainly see in Venezuela, which it's recognized around the world in many countries, in Africa, in other Latin American countries. It's recognized that there is a problem that many nations share, although each nation has to look at its predicament in its own way. Let's look at it from a Dutch and from a European perspective, Sietse. This year, definitely geopolitics is shaping in a different direction than before. The gloves are off, as Trump is showing us. Real politics are coming back. Kinetic reality is coming quite close to home in Europe in the form of inflation, war threats, a shift to militarization even although it's only in rhetoric, brave censorship having to do with the buildup of a totalitarian preparation for such conflicts. How do you see the European resistance, the European nations resisting in the coming years, facing this hard power instead of soft power coming out of the globalist occupation regime? Sietse?
Well, as you said, that there is perhaps this Middle Eastern country that is at the root of many of the problems in South America. as for instance we see in Argentina now, where Israeli soldiers masking as tourists had been arrested that were actually arsons. They were setting fires to Patagonia, and this has sparked a large outrage and has caused many people to go into the streets and say, kick out Judaism, kick out Zionism. And of course, this is under a country with a president that is openly pro-Zionist in the extreme. He doesn't leave any chance to go to the wall and be pictured at the Wailing Wall with the Hanukkah on his head. So yeah, that says a lot. But I think that Latin America perhaps doesn't suffocate under this intensely controlled narrative around Judea and about Israel and Zionist influence. In the Netherlands and large parts of Europe, it is extremely difficult to have the discussion of the influence of this country without risking going to jail. There is very little that you can say without being labeled an anti-Semite. But nonetheless, we can of course discuss the problems of large corporate and financial institutions that are plundering everything. There must be resistance. The European Union is, of course, constructing this large system of surveillance. They want to basically read every single app or Telegram or Twitter message that you send. So not just collecting it in order to be reviewed when you are transgressing the law, so that they have an archive they can look into when you commit criminal acts. What they want is in real time read everyone's emails. And we have already seen examples of this in the Netherlands, where there was a farmer who was invaded by special police units. They kicked down his door and held his family at gunpoint because an AI surveillance program misread his WhatsApp messages, and it said bomb, but he was talking about bomen, which is Dutch for trees, and it has bomb in it. But he wasn't a terrorist in the slightest bit. So these things are very essential to resist, and I think that one of the first steps has been done in the United Kingdom, where the government, or at least the Parliament, has voted against a digital ID, mandatory digital ID, and I think, well, that is one step in which Rupert Lau is this guy from Reform UK. He made a very good move and addressed all British people, not just leftist or rightist or Tory or Labour. He said, as British people, we have to refuse this digital ID structure. And he was successful, and he had MPs from all kinds of parties block this. And I think this is the way forward if we want to avoid internal conflicts like civil war, which is very close, very close, especially in countries like Britain, Ireland, in France, in Sweden, for instance. I think civil war is just, there only has to be one more incident, and it's going to catch fire. And we need these are the immediate problems, the very real risk of civil war, before we can even tackle a globalist ingression of our countries. So it is important that we find ways to unite the European people and go beyond this futile discussions about left or right or Christian or Muslim or Hindu, whatever whatever categorizations we all have, and come together and oppose. Just like, for instance, we are seeing now in Alberta, where there are lines and lines and lines of people going to voting booths to cast their vote to leave the Canadian Federation. They are seceding. Well, Canada can, of course, always deploy its military to stop them, but they are seceding from the Federation. These things are unprecedented. And we can very well see imagine the situation that, for instance, in the United States, there are going to be process of secession. The Constitution of America has this option. If states do not want to be part of the Union anymore, they can secede. And this is quite possible that this will happen. For instance, Texas, if the United States insists on not enforcing the border, Texas could leave. They have already threatened with this in the past. So there are shifts going on that are very, very hard to predict. But as far as European Union and European countries go, the immediate cause for concern is the very real danger of civil war.
I agree. Yeah.
Well, I think this, of course, this danger of civil war, the danger of larger kinetic conflict in general, is looming large over Europe. This is a clear fact that violence is re-entering the mainstream of Western conscience is also a fact, even if it's dosed gradually, even if it approaches gradually. And I think a big fight probably is ahead for the European peoples, wherever they are in the world. And I think even if we do not subscribe to the third worldism as a ideology, we can probably agree on its spirit, and that is the defense of the nation. So, like Latin Americans say, patria o muerte. Sometimes you have to choose, and sometimes the choice is between your honor, your identity, and death. And of course, if patriots and nationalists are willing to make that choice, there will be very little left of the globalist hegemon. That being said, I wish to thank our panel, Hans Vogel, who has been introducing Venezuela tonight, Sietse Bosman, who has joined us from Frisia, and I also like to thank our audience for tuning in to Leitstern, of which this was episode number 12. Goodbye.